Hey everyone, welcome to part 2, and let's just get right into it. Roll the intro. So let's fast forward a couple hundred years. The fervor of the new world is, upon European Western countries, right? Colonization has begun. And when it comes to literature in that era, you can divide it up. I'm talking like from the 1600s all the way until early 1900s. You could easily categorize Native representation by Western authors in 3 categories: the merciless / bloodthirsty savage, the noble savage, and then the half-breed.
I hate them. I got a war bag of reasons to hate them.
This trope in itself served actually a few purposes. One of them was to, vilify Native peoples, make them as unseemly as possible. Even the early Puritan letters to the crown are very much laced with a lot of rhetoric. We need more supplies, especially firearms and ammunition, to protect ourselves from the bloodthirsty savages, and it goes as far back to the Declaration of Independence, where, merciless savages are written in there. Whether or not that was more of a rhetorical tool or if that was something that Thomas Jefferson really felt, because Thomas Jefferson's his relations with Native peoples is interesting. For sure, brutality from Native peoples did exist. It's a well-known fact. Natives, we were very brutal to each other and obviously to, Western settlers. But the exaggeration that Natives were somehow soulless, bloodthirsty, had no regard to any goodness in life, no virtue, no purity, just bloodthirsty. Barbarians, it's the same rhetoric the Romans use on the Germanic peoples and the Celts. This dehumanization was a blatant propaganda tactic. Another narrative trope that emerged was also captive narratives. It's literally called the captive narrative. These were stories that stemmed from a couple of cases that happened with like 1 or 2 women that were taken after battles by Native peoples that were taken into captivity. And these stories were exaggerated. It was a really kind of exoticized, but also very much, demonizing Native peoples, because women, they needed to be protected. These captivity narratives, really helped drive that. It definitely continued to help demonize Native peoples. Another purpose that, this narrative served was so that, colonial peoples could have an enemy. The heroes need an enemy. They need some sort of antagonist to drive the story forward. And Native peoples were the obvious choice. There is a really interesting video series by Lessons of Old, and he talks about stories, and how, I guess you could say, the cautionary issues with, making so that your life is like a story. But one thing that he touched upon that I think is great is that he says that when you feed yourself this narrative, because part of Western, the doctrine of discovery, which was the basis of the entire colonization of the Western world, is that God intended for these countries and these people to conquer this land. That's a narrative that's been told to everybody. It's a story that is still told today. You can even go back to the descriptions of Custer's Last Stand. Just recently we had Victory Day. But even the descriptions of what the Indians did to the soldiers, some of them for sure happened, but I am positive that a lot of it was exaggerated.
Mr. President, this is a senseless argument.
A senseless argument? Do you know what they did to those men on that hill? They did things even I've never seen before.
Henry, the survival of the Indian is your deepest concern, isn't that so?
You know it is. I thought it was yours.
And it still is. I appointed an Indian to the head of Indian Affairs, I'll remind you. Another decision that your colleagues were so fond of, and another damn knot in the noose of this administration.
Along with a 3-year depression and a bankrupt treasury.
This isn't about money, gentlemen. This is about human beings. And when you make an agreement, you have a solemn obligation to fulfill...
In spite of this atrocity, I still believe that setting the Indians on the course to civilization best ensures his survival. Now, do you or do you not agree?
Yes, sir. I do.
And you can't deny that there's no saving the Sioux unless we compel them to give up their way of life and settle on the reservation.
I'll say it till my tongue bleeds. If we're ever going to claim what we bought from the French and whooped the Mexicans for, it's going to mean killing Indians.
A lot of this was, it fueled a fervor in the people in the West of that time in the country. It led up to the massacre of Wounded Knee and the displacement of other peoples. It narrows down to this, that Western Europeans at the time, they needed an enemy to fight against. They needed something to push them forward because they are the protagonists of their story.
On my challenge, by the ancient laws of combat, we are met at this chosen ground to settle for good and all who holds sway over the 5 points. Us natives, born rightwise to this fine land, or the foreign hordes defiling it.
They're the main characters in the game. Everyone else is just an NPC in their mind's eye in the past. Some really do think that now, still though. The next trope, it is an interesting one, is the noble savage. The noble savage kind of serves as a double-edged sword. It represents kind of a schizophrenic anxiety that I personally think that American colonial people have when it comes to recognizing what happened with indigenous peoples. There was a series of tales written by James Fenimore Cooper. It was called the Leatherstocking Tales, where these narratives and the Leatherstocking Tales and others like it of that era, they pitted good Indians against bad Indians. And again, that's going back to the Last of the Mohicans. These stories served as a way to kind of, in my opinion, this is just me, just looking at it from a bird's eye view of that colonial guilt. We think that, white Americans are guilty about it now, but a lot more people back then were very much aware and very much fighting against the treatment of indigenous peoples.
Hijo! Hijo! Niha, ehadsamen. Na, ni Thomas.
The Cherokee removal, there were Catholic priests and other Protestant pastors who went with the Cherokee people and were exiled to Oklahoma with them. So it isn't that, people weren't sympathetic then, they certainly were. And these stories are a reflection of that. But the problem with these stories is that they still put the American protagonist at the top. They are still the hero. The antagonist is still a bloodthirsty savage, but the one character that is usually introduced is a side character, a sidekick type character, a noble type native. Another thing with the noble savage narrative is that this is the beginning of how native peoples were beginning to become exoticized and idealized. Natives in these books and these stories were very much in touch with Mother Earth and all that stuff, The noble savage, like I said, it's kind of this schizophrenic hodgepodge of both self-awareness while maintaining, American superiority. The next trope I kind of wanted to touch on is the half-breed.
There's been a homicide on Indian land.
They sent him to a foreign land.
What's my cover?
In the middle of America.
You're going in there as who you are, an American Indian federal officer.
To uncover the truth.
So this one is interesting because it's complicated. in literature at least. A lot of these stories, the protagonist or at least a side character in a story is native, but they're either actually half or part native, or they are a native person, but they've been completely assimilated into American culture and they've kind of left their culture behind. And either way, these stories make these people allies to the American cause and American sympathies. These stories, one of the purposes is to kind of illustrate, based on real life cases, of how, the Indian can be assimilated into the American way of life. It was around this time too when, there was the idea of assimilating native children into American culture. These stories served as a way to prove that this is possible and that these native peoples can be assimilated. In an interesting, weird turn of events with these books when it comes to the half-breed trope, native characters in romance novels, mostly written by women, are exoticized.
I'll never speak to you any other way. So afraid you would come after me.
The story is usually centered around a white woman who is captivated by a native man or a half-native man. And in these stories, it never works out. It's more of like a fantasy. And in the end, she is rescued or going back to the man who she's supposed to be, another white American male. Speaking of romance novels, there are also a couple where we see more and more of the exotification, the exoticisms around native women as well as native men. The exoticism around native women actually kind of goes as far back as Amerigo Vespucci. He mentions the woman. It's very interesting. He comments on their figures and stuff like that. We start to see the colonial attitudes of the exotic native woman, and we get the words like squaw thrown around a lot. When it comes to the exoticism surrounding native men and women, those deserve their own respective videos, which I plan on talking about later. But I just wanted to make note that this is where, in this area, is where we start to see that exoticism. It started with Amerigo, it went all the way to Pocahontas, and it still happens today. And I'll talk more about that in more specific cases in a later video. In this era, there is, an attempt to kind of show the nuance of mixed characters. In the end, though, these characters are usually killed off or something else just bad happens to them. They die or they go insane. They just disappeared from the story, and the white American characters are usually have a happy ending. The authors of these stories, even if they were at their most sympathetic, they don't seem to have an answer to the plight of native peoples around this time. They kind of tiptoe around it. There's no real attempt to figure out what these native characters or native people in general, where their place is in American society. So that's my little breakdown of the three kind of major tropes, archetypes you could call them, in literature. And this is stemming all the way from late 1600s all the way to about, the early 1900s. But things started changing with live shows and then later into film. But that's it for now. Go ahead, like and subscribe, share. I'm gonna do this part 3. I'm gonna go more in depth about media that we're more familiar with, and some additional things that I found fascinating as well. So we'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.